Hi, everyone, uh, and welcome to Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. What's the deal with God's omniscience? Omniscience uh, is the idea that you know everything. Everything that is knowable is known by God. Omniscience is considered one of God's attributes, along with other attributes like omnipotence and omnipresence, and some would also say omnibenevolence. But I'm talking about omniscience. God knows everything. So, uh, how do we know this? How do we know that God knows everything? And, you could make the simple argument that, well, because God has created everything, God must know everything. Because if he can control everything that he's created, and all that there is what he has created and himself, then he must know everything. How else could you control everything that you've created unless you know everything about what you've created? So there's a very simple argument why God is omniscient. But I'm going to give you a more complicated argument as to why God must know everything. Uh, so there's a question. This is an interesting question. The question is the entire universe and its history known to God without the need for the universe to actually exist? So, what this is asking is, does God know everything about the universe, its history, everything that ever happens in it, without ever actually having to create the universe? Does he already know that already? And the answer to this question is yes. Yes, he in fact does know everything before the universe exists. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. Now, this question touches upon the topic of free will because you know some people will say, well, because God knows everything that's going to ever happen before it ever happens. Well, then how could you have free will to choose something? God already knows what you're going to do. So how could your will be free in that sense? Seems like it's all predetermined. Well, that's a complicated question, and I've already done a video on free will, and you can look at that, and that'll give you sort of my explanation as to how you can still have a form of free will, even though God knows already in advance what you're going to do. Now, an important thing to remember is God is not subject to time, so God doesn't think in sequence or in a temporal order. Now, that's very mysterious, and there's no way to explain it except to simply say that that is the case with God. So, this video is not really about free will. I'm not going to talk about free will. I'm talking about omniscience, God's knowledge. And how do we know that God has to know everything? Well, one thing you can say about knowledge is, where does knowledge come from? Uh, and all the knowledge that there is in the universe comes from the universe, right? Surprise, surprise. That's where it comes from. And the universe uses material processes, and it uses cause and effect to create new information or new knowledge in any given moment of time. And that knowledge and that new information is caused by the previous moment in time. And the information from that previous moment in time is caused by the moment previous to that. So all knowledge in the universe is really derived from prior knowledge, or this prior sequence of cause and effect in the material processes of the universe. So this creates a very important principle that all knowledge is derivative from other knowledge. This means that all knowledge is derived from other knowledge, at least in terms of knowledge from the universe itself. So this is a very important principle. All knowledge is derived from other knowledge. All knowledge is contingent upon other knowledge. It all knowledge has its existence based on being derived from other knowledge, pre-existing knowledge. It's all contingent on previous knowledge. So this is how the universe itself works. Uh, any moment of time in the universe is contingent on what happened previous in the universe through this cause and effect and uh, this sort of deterministic outcome. At a quantum level, it's more probabilistic, but it's essentially there's still cause and effect in the universe that determines what happens today. What happens today is determined by what happened yesterday. And it's the same thing with knowledge. All knowledge is derived from other knowledge. All knowledge is sequentially linked to prior knowledge, to what happened before. Um, so all knowledge is contingent on other knowledge. And a simple way to think about this is, well, let's say you think about the number one, right? All right. Number one. That's a form of knowledge. And then you say, well, what is that contingent on? How is one derived from prior knowledge? Well, I could say, sure, it is. Because one is equal to a half plus a half. Okay. So how do I know a half is derived from prior knowledge? Well, I could say, okay, well, a half is equal to a quarter plus a quarter. Okay, so that's also derived. And I could just keep doing this for infinity. I could just keep cutting it in half and giving you what that's derived from. And this is a simplified illustration, but that's the general point I'm trying to make, is that all knowledge is derived from prior knowledge. It all has a derivation. It's all based on pre-existing knowledge, and it's sequential, and it can go back infinitely. So, and I'm not saying time goes back infinitely, but knowledge can. That this sequence of derivation can go on infinitely. Um, so it's an important thing to understand in terms of God about the nature of knowledge and that it's all derivative. So again, how do we know all knowledge is derivative? Well, because we know the universe is derivative, and all knowledge comes from the universe. So because the universe is derivative, This moment in time is derived from what happened in the previous moments of time. We can say the same thing about knowledge, because all knowledge comes from the universe. So all knowledge behaves just like the universe, subject to cause and effect. It all has to be derived from prior knowledge. So then you ask about, well, God's knowledge. God is a special case because God is the only uncaused being. Every other being is created, is caused. Human beings are caused. I don't care what being you're talking about. If it's not God, it's a caused being, created being. But God is uncaused. God is a special, unique being, unique. And uncaused means there was no cause for his existence. God simply is. And I've done other videos explaining this. But so God is a special case. God is uncaused, which means God's knowledge, the knowledge God has in his mind, is also uncaused. So God's knowledge, his omniscience, is uncaused. That means he has it. He doesn't have to acquire knowledge. He has the knowledge. It's part of his uncaused existence. Now, I know that doesn't make any sense to a caused being like us. I know this is mystery. It's mysterious. There's no way to explain it. You can just say that logically it must be true. So, God's knowledge is uncaused. Okay, so God has this uncaused knowledge, but is it possible that God can learn things? Is it possible that God can acquire knowledge, more knowledge? Could, he create new knowledge from his uncaused knowledge? And the answer is no. You can't. Why is that? Well, because all knowledge is derived from other knowledge. It's all derived from other knowledge, which means it's all contingent upon prior knowledge or other knowledge. Well, that means that for God to know anything at all, he has to know knowledge that is derived from other knowledge or is contingent upon other knowledge. So if he knows something, some knowledge, piece of knowledge, but that knowledge is derived from other knowledge, well, he has to know the other knowledge too in order to know the knowledge you're talking about. So it assumes, yes, he has to know the knowledge from which it's derived. But that derived knowledge, or that knowledge from which it's derived, that's also contingent knowledge on other knowledge. So God has to know the knowledge that you derive that other knowledge from. He's got to know that too. And you keep doing this for infinity. And you'll find that for God to know anything at all, since all knowledge is derived from other knowledge, he must know all knowledge that there is. Logically, he has to know all things. So there can't be new knowledge to God because all knowledge is derivative. And he has to know all the derived, he has to know all the knowledge upon which it's derived. And all that knowledge is derived. So he's got to know all the knowledge that it's derived on, and so on and so on and so on, which means he's got to know everything. To know anything at all, God has to know everything. So for God, all knowledge must be known. For any knowledge to be known. So, because we know God must have knowledge as an uncaused being, because without knowledge, he can't create anything, because he has to know what he's creating to be able to create it. So, God has to have knowledge. And that he's got to know everything because knowledge is derived from other knowledge. All knowledge is derived from other knowledge. Therefore, if he knows something, he's got to know everything, which means all that uncaused knowledge that is in God's mind is complete. There is nothing else that is knowable that God does not already know. He has the complete set of all derived knowledge, which means he's completely omniscient, which means there is no new knowledge to God. He cannot create new knowledge. He simply knows everything that is knowable. Can't create new knowledge. And because God can't create new knowledge that God doesn't already know, it answers this first question. So, since God knows everything that can be known, he can't create new knowledge, then God has to know everything that would happen in the history of the universe without the universe ever having to have to exist. See? So the universe itself can't create new knowledge that God is not aware of, because God has to be aware of all knowable things. So the answer is God already knows what you're going to do before you do it. He knows the entire history of the universe before the end of the universe, before the universe even began. He already knows everything about it. That's what omniscience is. And logically, this is why that has to be the case. Now, you could ask, well, why can't God forget some of his knowledge? Right? He could have it and then say, well, I'm going to forget the knowledge. That way it'll be new to me, right? Like you're watching, some Netflix series for the second time, and you could magically forget that you saw it the first time. Now it's all new to you again, right? No, God can't perform that trick. And the reason is, you can say, well, God is omnipotent. He should be able to forget knowledge, shouldn't he? He should be able to have the power to do that. And the answer is no. There is no power to do that. And the reason is because God's omniscience, God's knowledge is uncaused. Uncaused. Uh, you can't forget that which is uncaused. You can't, because forgetting is destroying. You can't destroy that which is uncaused. It doesn't have a cause. So there's no way to uncause it. You can't destroy it. It's uncaused. If it was created, you could destroy it, you could forget it. But because it's uncaused knowledge, you can't forget it. So God can't forget his knowledge. It's impossible. It's not. There's no power that would allow an uncaused thing to be destroyed or forgotten. Can't happen. So logically, there is no power that would allow God to forget knowledge. So God can't do that. And that's not a knock on his omnipotence. What I'm saying is there is no power that would allow God to do that. God has all powers that there are. But if there's a power that doesn't exist, it's not possible. Well, God can't have it. So that's not a knock on God's omnipotence. What you're really saying is it's logically incoherent or logically impossible to say that an uncaused thing could be destroyed. Um, that's like saying, well, can God create a square circle? And the answer is no, God can't create a square circle because there's no such thing as a square circle. It's inherently contradictory. There's no power that exists that would allow that thing to be created. And that's the same thing with trying to undo that which is uncaused. It's logically incoherent. Can't be done. It's impossible. So God can't forget his own knowledge. So there is no new knowledge to God. God knows everything. Everything that's knowable, God knows it. Uh, and it's all uncaused, and he can't forget any of it. So the answer to this question is absolutely yes. God's knowledge is uncaused. Because all knowledge is derivative of their knowledge, God must know everything that is knowable. There is no new knowledge to God, and God cannot forget his knowledge. So the answer is absolutely yes. God does know everything that's going to happen in the history of the universe before it ever happens. And the universe doesn't even have to exist, doesn't even have to be real for God to know everything that would happen if it were made real. So the answer is absolutely yes. All right. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I'll be happy to address them. And I hope you enjoyed this video on God's omniscience. So take care.